he asked about her the same evening. The luncheon had barely ended. The dishes were still being cleared, the candles still burning low, and Count Adrian Blackmore was supposed to be reviewing the winter estate contracts with his steward. Instead, he stood at the window of his study with a glass of untouched wine, watching the covered walkway that led to his sister's wing, and thinking about a girl he did not know the name of. He waited until Elara came to bid him good night, as she always did, and he raised the question with the careful casualness of a man who has prepared it. "The maidens you brought today, are they new?" Lady Elara Blackmore paused at the doorway, one gloved hand resting on the frame. She was beautiful and sharp, his sister, and she had always been able to tell when he was being careful. "Mira has been with me 3 years," Elara said, her voice cool and even. "The other one, the Marin girl, about 2 years. She is from the village. Her father is dead, her mother is an invalid. She has small children to support." A pause. "That is why she is always late and always slightly disheveled and always somehow the most irritating presence in any room she enters." "She seemed capable," Adrian said. "She is barely adequate." Elara pulled her glove straight at the wrist with one precise tug. "She reads, apparently, which is a waste of education on a girl in her position. She thinks more than she should for someone whose thoughts are entirely irrelevant. Honestly, Adrian, if I were not soft-hearted, I would have replaced her months ago." Adrian said nothing. He lifted his wineglass and looked at the color of it against the candlelight. "What is her name?" "The full name. Gretel Marin." Elara tilted her head slightly. "Why?" "I was simply asking," he said, and changed the subject. But he was not simply asking. He had been holding the girl in his mind since the moment she stepped into the receiving room, since he had watched her move through the space with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to take up very little room, and then glanced, in the single unguarded moment, at the shelf of books against the wall. The way a person looks at something familiar, the way a person looks at home. Gretel Marin. Worthless, his sister said. He turned the word over the way you turn a coin found on an unfamiliar road, wondering where it came from, and what it was worth, and why someone had felt the need to leave it there. It did not fit. He had met worthless people. He had met people who moved through the world taking without thinking, performing without feeling, filling space without ever once noticing what the space contained. This girl had noticed everything. He had watched her notice. He set down his wine. He sat at his desk. He opened the estate contracts. He read the same paragraph 4 times, but to understand what happened next. To understand why a count would seek out a servant girl, why a servant girl would not simply be grateful, and why a word like worthless, spoken carelessly by the wrong person, would set something irreversible into motion. You have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a cottage with a door that only closed properly if you lifted it slightly. You have to go back to 2 small girls asleep beneath a shared quilt, and a woman by the window who could not walk, and a 19-year-old girl already running before the sun had finished rising. You have to go back to the morning everything began, which looked, from the outside, like every other morning. It was not. The candle was already burning low when Gretel's eyes opened. She lay still for exactly 3 seconds. She had learned not to allow herself more, letting the cold air of the room press against her face while her mind assembled the day ahead. Hazel needed her cough looked at. There was half a loaf of bread left, enough for breakfast but not enough for supper. Her mother's salve was running low, and the herbalist on the village road charged 3 coppers for a new pot. 3 coppers. She had 2. She pushed the thought aside, swung her legs from the cot, and began. Hazel was already half awake, blinking at her like a small owl from beneath the quilt. Gretel touched her forehead, warm, but not worryingly so, and smoothed the child's hair. "Is it morning already, Gret?" "Almost." "Close your eyes 5 more minutes while I heat the water. Can I have the piece with the crust? Olivia always takes the crust. I will give you the crust, promise." "Promise?" Gretel pressed her lips against the child's forehead. "I promise." By the time the bread was sliced and her mother propped gently against her pillow, Olivia had appeared from beneath her blanket announcing that a thrush outside the window was singing its alarm call and that this meant rain by afternoon. "That is very useful," Gretel said, tying the child's 2nd braid. "Hold still. Will you be late again?" "I am never late. Mama says you are always late." From the bed by the window, their mother made a small sound that was unmistakably a suppressed laugh. "I am occasionally delayed," Gretel corrected with dignity, kissing Olivia's head. "Which is a different thing entirely." She was out the door and running before the thrush had finished its alarm. Lady Elara Blackmore was 24 years old, beautiful in the way that cold mornings are beautiful, all clear lines and sharp air, impressive to observe but unpleasant to be close to. She had her brother's dark hair and none of his rumoured restraint. Where Count Adrian was known throughout Veldenmoor as a man of measured temperament and occasional kindness, Lady Elara was known among the household staff as a woman whose moods changed faster than the weather and left damage far longer. She was not cruel in the dramatic sense. She did not shout or throw things. She was cruel in the precise, deliberate way of someone who has always had power and never once questioned whether she deserved it. A raised eyebrow here, a softly delivered comparison there, a patience worn away by 100 small cuts. Gretel arrived that morning with 4 minutes to spare. She slipped through the servants' entrance, smoothed her apron and took her place with the other maidens, just as the clock in the corridor began to strike the hour. She caught the eye of Mira, a girl of similar age who had served in the ladies' wing for 3 years and had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of Elara's moods and a gift for communicating danger through eyebrow movement alone. Mira's current expression, both brows slightly raised, lips pressed together, meant, "Difficult morning, proceed carefully." Gretel gave the smallest nod. Lady Elara was seated at her dressing table when they entered, her reflection regarding them all with the mild interest of someone evaluating fruit at a market. "You," she said, and her gaze landed on Gretel with the precision of a needle finding a vein. "You are the Marin girl." "Yes, my lady." "You were late on Tuesday. I apologize, my lady." "It will not. I did not ask for an apology. I made a statement." Elara turned back to her reflection and picked up a silver comb. "Braid my hair, and try not to pull. The last time you braided it, you left a tangle at the nape that I was still finding at midday." Gretel stepped forward and began, her fingers moving with practiced care. She did not speak. She had learned that silence was the safest language in this room. But Lady Elara was not finished. "Tell me, Marin girl. Your mother, she is the one who cannot walk." "Yes, my lady. And you have 2 small sisters." "He passed away 4 years ago, my lady." A pause. "You must be very tired." It was said without sympathy. It was said the way one notes that a cart horse looks worn, a clinical observation with no intention of lightening the load. "I manage well enough, my lady." "Do you? You are consistently the last to arrive. Your uniform hem came undone last Thursday, and you presented yourself in that state for the better part of an afternoon. Your mind wanders during assignments." Elara watched Gretel's fingers in the mirror. "My brother would dismiss a servant for less." Gretel said nothing. Her fingers did not pause. "You are lucky," Elara continued, "that I have a habit of keeping charity cases. It gives me patience that other mistresses lack." The word charity landed like a stone in still water. Gretel felt it ripple through her chest but showed nothing on her face. She had learned, too, that her face was something she needed to keep for herself, the only thing in this house that truly belonged to her. "Your braid is finished, my lady," she said quietly. Elara examined it in the mirror. A flicker of reluctant approval crossed her face before she smoothed it away. "Acceptable. Go help with the breakfast tray." Gretel curtsied and went. In the corridor outside, Mira fell into step beside her and murmured, "You have iron nerves, you know that." "I have younger sisters," Gretel replied. "It's the same discipline." What Lady Elara did not know, what no one in the household knew, was that Gretel Marin could read. Not just read in the labored way of someone who had been taught their letters and could work through a notice or a church pamphlet given enough time. Gretel read the way other people breathed, naturally, hungrily, without effort. Her father had been a schoolteacher's assistant before illness took his position and eventually his life, and in the years before that, he had taught Gretel as though she were his most promising student, because she was. She kept this entirely to herself. A servant who could read was a servant who could be suspected of reading things she should not. A servant who could read was a servant with a dangerous sort of access. And so Gretel folded this part of herself away, like a letter kept inside a boot, present, hidden, waiting. But sometimes, in the early morning before the house stirred, she would slip a book from Lady Elara's shelf. Always the same one, always returned before it could be missed, and read by the light coming under the kitchen door. That morning, before her duties called her away, she had read 3 pages of a surveyor's account of the Northern Territories. It was not romantic. It was not exciting, but it was hers. She was smiling faintly when she carried the breakfast tray in, and no one in the room could have said why. Chapter 2. The announcement came on a grey Thursday morning 3 weeks into autumn. Lady Elara would be attending a formal luncheon at the main castle. Count Adrian had requested the attendance of his sister for a meeting regarding the estate accounts and the upcoming winter contracts with the tenant farmers. It was not the kind of event Elara particularly enjoyed. She found discussions of agriculture tedious, but her brother's invitations were, in practice, commands. She required an escort of 2 maidens. Mira was selected immediately. Mira was always selected for public appearances because she moved with a quiet elegance that reflected well on the household. The second choice surprised everyone, including Gretel. Marin, Lady Elara said, without looking up from her correspondence, "You will attend as well." A small silence in the room. Mira glanced at Gretel. Gretel kept her face carefully neutral. "Yes, my lady," she said. Later, in the corridor, Mira grabbed her arm. "Why you? She never takes you for public occasions." "I don't know. She's up to something." "She is always up to something," Gretel said mildly. "I'll manage." But she pressed her hands together briefly when Mira wasn't looking, steadying something inside herself. The main castle. She had never been inside the main castle. Nothing could have prepared her for how large it was. She had seen it from the outside, of course. But outside, your eye could organize it. This tower there, that courtyard here, those windows in their rows. Inside, the scale became something else entirely. The entrance hall alone was twice the size of the entire cottage where she lived, with vaulted ceilings that made your voice feel small and floors of pale stone, veined with grey that had been polished to a cold shine. Portraits lined the corridor they walked through. Counts and countesses going back 2 centuries, their painted eyes following with painted indifference. Gretel kept her gaze forward and her breathing even. She was there to carry things and stand quietly. She would carry things and stand quietly. The luncheon was held in a smaller receiving room off the main hall. Smaller being relative, given that it could comfortably seat 30. A long table held a spread that Gretel recognized represented more food than her family saw in a fortnight. She arranged herself near the wall beside Mira and folded her hands and disappeared into the wallpaper, as was expected. Count Adrian Blackmore arrived 7 minutes after his sister. Gretel had built an image of him over 2 years of vague references and distant silhouettes. Tall, dark, distant, probably self-important in the way of wealthy men who have never had to apologize to anyone. She was wrong about the last part. He entered without ceremony, no announcement, no fanfare. He was perhaps 30, with the kind of face that was not immediately handsome but became so the longer you looked. Strong jaw, grey eyes, a slight furrow between his brows that suggested he was either often thinking or often concerned, possibly both. He greeted his sister with a brief embrace that seemed genuine, asked after her health with what appeared to be actual interest, and then turned his attention to the room with the alert, measured manner of someone who takes inventory without making it obvious. His eyes moved across the servants by the wall with the absent sweep of habit, and then stopped. Gretel realized, with a slow, strange alarm, that he had stopped at her. She looked away immediately, looked at the wall above the fireplace, at the portrait of some past countess who had clearly had opinions about being painted. She did not look back. She was very careful not to look back. It happened during the meal, when Gretel was refilling the water pitchers. She moved along the table quietly, as she had been taught, visible only enough to be useful. She reached the Count's side and began to pour, and she was almost past him when his voice came. Low, not designed to carry. "You have read that book." She went still. He was looking at her directly now, with that measuring gaze, and she understood with a cold, clarifying certainty that she had made an error she could not immediately identify. "My lord," she managed. "The Veldenmoor Territorial Survey," he said quietly. "Harwick's edition, 1847. You had ink on your left index finger when you arrived. The particular smear pattern of someone who reads with their finger trailing the margin. And you glanced at the spine of that volume on the shelf when you entered, the way a person recognizes something familiar." He paused. "I am not angry. I am curious." The room continued around them. Lady Elara was in conversation with the estate steward. Mira was across the room. No one was watching this exchange. Gretel made a decision in the space of a breath. "I borrowed it, my lord. From Lady Elara's shelf. I always return it before she notices. I have read it 4 times. 4 times, he repeated. Why? It has very precise maps, she said, and heard the slight defensiveness in her own voice and could not quite stop it. I have never been north of this estate. The maps are the closest I have gotten." A beat of silence. Something shifted in Count Adrian Blackmore's expression, something that softened without losing its intelligence. He looked at her the way people look at things they have found unexpectedly interesting. Then he appeared to recall himself, and his gaze returned to the table. "I have a better edition," he said very quietly. "Illustrated, published in Erith in 1853. If you wish to see it." She poured the last of the water and stepped back, her hands perfectly steady. "Thank you, my lord," she said, which was not an acceptance and was not a refusal and was, she hoped, the answer of someone who had not just had her heart lurch sideways in her chest. She returned to her place by the wall. She did not look at him again. He did not look at her again either. Or so she told herself, because it was safer than the alternative. He asked about her the same evening. He was careful. He mentioned it at the end of a conversation about the estate staff, when Elara was distracted by the dessert course and the inquiry could pass as administrative. "The maidens you brought today, are they new?" "Mira has been with me 3 years, Elara said, pulling apart a small pastry with delicate fingers. "The other one, the Marin girl, about 2 years. She is from the village. Her father is dead, her mother is an invalid, she has small children to care for. That is why she is always late and always slightly disheveled and always somehow the most irritating presence in any room she enters. She seemed capable. She is barely adequate." Elara waved her hand slightly. "She reads, apparently, which is a waste of education on a girl in her position. She thinks more than she should for someone whose thoughts are entirely irrelevant. Honestly, Adrian, if I were not soft-hearted, I would have replaced her months ago." Adrian said nothing. He lifted his wine glass and examined the color of the liquid against the candlelight. "What is her name? The full name, Gretel Marin. Why? If you are thinking of reassigning her to the main castle, I would appreciate advance notice. She is annoying, but at least I know her deficiencies." "I was simply asking," Adrian said, and changed the subject. But he had heard the name. He had already been holding it in his mind like a coin found on an unfamiliar road, turning it over, wondering where it had come from and what it was worth. Gretel Marin, the girl who read surveyor's accounts 4 times for the maps. "Worthless," his sister said. He turned the word over too and found that it did not fit. Chapter 3. On the 4th morning, a note arrived for Gretel, delivered by one of the main castle footmen with the careful blankness of someone who had been instructed to show no reaction regardless of how the recipient responded. It said, "The East Library. After the household evening bell, if you choose." It was unsigned, it did not need to be. Gretel read it twice in the linen cupboard where she had retreated to have privacy, then folded it and put it in her apron pocket, and spent the rest of the day pretending her mind was entirely on the tasks in front of her. She asked Mira, obliquely, what she knew of the main castle's East Library. "It's his," Mira said, without looking up from the embroidery she was mending. "The Count's private collection. No one goes in there except by invitation. Why? Curiosity." Mira looked up then. Her eyes were very sharp. "Gretel, it is only a library," Gretel said. "He noticed you at the luncheon. He noticed I had ink on my finger." "He noticed you," Mira repeated carefully. "Be careful. Elara notices everything and she will not like it." Gretel looked at the floor, then at the window, then at Mira. "I know," she said. "I'll be careful." She went. The East Library was everything she had imagined a library should be and had never allowed herself to want. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a fire already lit, 2 chairs facing each other at an angle that suggested they had been placed there deliberately, and the particular deep silence of a room where many thousands of words lived and waited. Count Adrian was already there, standing at a shelf not in the formal coat he had worn at the luncheon, but in plainer clothes. A dark jacket, no decoration, the look of a man in a room where he did not feel the need to perform rank. He turned when she entered. The illustrated edition of Harwick's survey was on the low table between the chairs. "You came," he said. "You said if I chose," she replied. "I chose." Brief pause, during which she had the impression he was recalibrating something. "Sit, please." She sat. He sat across from her, and for a moment they both looked at the book between them, and the strangeness of the situation settled over Gretel fully. She was sitting in the private library of Count Adrian Blackmore, who was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read, and there was no tray to carry, no task to perform, no reason to be here except that she was here. "You know," she said finally, "if anyone finds out I came here, I will lose my position, I know. I am sorry for that. I could not think of another way to." He paused. "I wanted to speak with you without an audience." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I have spoken to a great many people in this house over a great many years, and I cannot recall the last time I spoke to someone who looked at a book the way you looked at that shelf when you walked in just now." Gretel looked at the shelf in question, a row of natural philosophy texts and regional histories, and then back at him. "How did I look at it? Like it was a friend you hadn't seen in a long time." The honesty of it caught her unprepared. She found she had to look at the fire instead. "My lord," she said carefully, "I do not know what you want from this conversation, and I think it would be better if we were clear about." "Nothing," he said, and the word was simple and immediate enough that she believed it. "I want nothing except to talk, and for you to tell me what it is you want if you had the freedom to choose." The fire crackled. She thought about lying, about deflecting, about the safe, careful answers she had learned to give in this house. Then she thought about the surveyor's maps, about the pages she read at 4 in the morning by borrowed light, about the words she turned over in her mind during the hours of carrying trays and braiding hair and standing silently against walls. "I want to go north," she said, "to the territories, to see if the maps are right." "Are you not afraid of what you might find?" "I am afraid of never finding out," she said. "That is worse." Count Adrian Blackmore looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is." They talked for 2 hours. About books, about the territories, about a dozen things that had nothing to do with rank or household position, or the careful distance between the seen and the unseen. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. She gave them and found, to her surprise, that they were her real answers. Not the trimmed, careful versions she kept for safety, but the actual thoughts she usually only trusted to the pre-dawn quiet. When the hour grew late and she rose to go, he rose too. "Gretel," he said, her name, her first name, which no one in this house had spoken in 2 years. "Will you come again?" "Thursday. Same time." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I will come again." Elara found out on the second Thursday. She did not find out through spying, she was too proud for that, but through the particular social intelligence of a woman who has spent her entire life in a household and knows its rhythms the way a musician knows a score. Gretel was absent at the evening bell for the second time in a week. A footman returning from the east corridor was seen passing through with a particular unhurried competence that suggested an errand completed, not begun. And Elara, who missed nothing, added the details together and arrived at a conclusion that turned her face to stone. She said nothing that evening. She said nothing for 2 days. When she acted, she did so with precision. She called Gretel to her chambers alone, dismissed the other maidens, and sat very still in her high-backed chair looking at the girl she had spent 2 years diminishing, and said, "I know about the library." Gretel did not flinch. She had been waiting for this. "My lady, do not explain, do not apologize. I am not interested in either." Elara's voice was as smooth and cold as the stone floors. "I am going to tell you something as a kindness. Because whatever my brother has told you, whatever you imagine this is, you are a servant girl from a dying family in a village cottage, and that is what you will remain. He will tire of the novelty. He always does. And when he does, you will have nothing. No position, no reputation, and nowhere to return to, because I will ensure that every house in this district knows your character." The words were designed to land in a specific order, each one finding the softest place. Gretel felt them. She felt everyone. But she also felt something else. A slow, clarifying anger that had been gathering for 2 years of charity case and Marin girl and the small, precise cruelties that arrived daily, and this was the moment it found its shape. "My lady," she said very quietly, "you have my notice. I am leaving your employ." A silence so complete that the candles seemed louder. "I beg your pardon. I give 2 weeks as courtesy," Gretel said. "After that, I will seek other employment." She curtsied, because she had been taught to, and because it cost her nothing, and because she would leave this room with dignity if she left with nothing else. She walked out before her hands could start shaking. They started shaking in the corridor, but that was the corridor's business. What Gretel did not know, what no one except Elara and the family solicitor knew, was this. Martha Maren, Gretel's mother, had not always been a woman in a cottage with a sagging roof. 20 years ago, Martha had been the personal companion and closest friend of Adrian and Elara's mother, the late Countess Isabel. They had grown up together on neighboring estates before circumstances separated them. The Countess married up, and Martha married down, and the distance between them grew with the distance between their stations. But the Countess had not forgotten. In her will, kept in the estate's legal records and known to Elara for the past 3 years, the late Countess Isabel had left a provision that Martha Maren and her children should never be in want, and that the estate bore a debt of care to that family. The provision had never been enacted. It had been, in the legal term, delayed pending review, which was, in plain language, buried. Elara had buried it, because if Gretel Maren were a woman with legal claim on the estate's protection, she was not a charity case. She was not worthless. She was something else entirely. And Lady Elara had understood, with the instinct of someone who has always protected her position, that this distinction mattered. She had kept Gretel close, where she could be watched. She had kept her small, where she could be managed. What Elara had not anticipated was her brother finding out on his own. Chapter 4. Adrian found the provision entirely by accident. He had been reviewing the estate's legal archive in preparation for the winter contracts, the same meeting that had first brought Gretel to the main castle, when the solicitor mentioned, with the careful vagueness of someone who has been careful for too long, that there were several older provisions still awaiting review. Adrian reviewed them. He found the Countess Isabel's bequest on a Tuesday afternoon. He read it twice. He sat with it for a long time. Then he sent for his sister. The conversation that followed was quiet, as their conversations always were, but it had a quality to it that Elara recognized from childhood, the particular stillness her brother achieved when something in him had gone cold. You knew about this. A pause. Elara was many things, but she had never been able to lie to him in direct confrontation. It was one of the few places where his opinion still held weight. 3 years. He said nothing for a very long moment. She worked in your household for 2 years, Elara. She ran to work every morning to avoid dismissal. She could not afford salve for her mother. She was under our mother's protection. She was entitled to care from this estate. And you put her in your service and called her a charity case. Elara stood very straight. I did what was necessary. Why? She was silent. And in that silence, Adrian understood something he had not fully assembled before, the way she had described Gretel at the luncheon. Worthless, barely adequate, irritating. The specific quality of those words, the specificity of someone who found it necessary to diminish. You were afraid, he said, of what she might become if she knew she had standing. Elara said nothing, which was all the answer he needed. He left her sitting in that room with the architecture of 3 years of careful management and did not look back. He went to the cottage himself. He did not send a messenger. He rode to the village in the early evening with a single accompanying footman and knocked on the door that only closed properly if you lifted it slightly. Olivia opened it. She stared at him with the complete unfiltered assessment of a 7-year-old evaluating an unexpected visitor, taking in the horse, the coat, the general air of significance. Are you important? She asked. Some people think so, Adrian said seriously. Is your sister home? Gretel, Olivia called, without removing her eyes from him. There is an important man at the door. From inside. Olivia, what have I told you about? Gretel appeared behind her sister, took in the figure on the threshold, and went very still. They looked at each other through the half-opened door. My lord, she said finally, you should not be here, I know. May I come in? A pause. Behind Gretel, a small voice, Hazel said, Is that the important man? He has a nice horse. And from the bed by the window, barely audible, a woman's voice, Gretel. Let him in. Gretel stepped back. Adrian entered the cottage. He had to duck slightly for the doorframe. He crossed to the bed by the window, because he already knew, and crouched to the level of the woman lying there. Grey-haired, clear-eyed, with a face that Gretel had inherited in its fundamental quality, that particular quality of looking at the world directly. "Mrs. Marin," he said, "I am Adrian Blackmore. I believe you knew my mother." Marta Marin looked at him for a long moment. Then something in her face opened like a door someone had thought sealed. "You have her eyes," she said. "I have been wondering when someone from that house would come." "I should have come 3 years ago," he said. "I am sorry. I did not know." Marta looked past him to where Gretel stood in the doorway of her own home, watching this exchange with an expression that was trying very hard to maintain control and not entirely succeeding. "Now you do," Marta said simply, and then to her daughter, "Come here, Gretel." "Stop hovering." Gretel came. She stood beside her mother's bed and looked down at the man crouching there and up at Cecing and at her hands, and finally, when she had run out of other places to look, at him. "You didn't have to come yourself," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." He stood. "I have been reading things that should have been acted on years ago. The estate owes your family. I don't want what the estate owes us," she said, and her voice was flat and clear. "I have managed without it. I know you have. I have seen how you've managed." He looked at her steadily. "I am not here about the estate's debt, Gretel. I am here because I have been in that library twice since Thursday and I could not concentrate on a single page, and I finally had to admit why." The room was very quiet. From the bed, a small voice. "Gret, he likes you," Gretel said with feeling. "What? He does." Adrian, to his credit, did not pretend otherwise. "She is correct," he said, and the simplicity of it, the lack of performance or decoration, was somehow more devastating than anything elaborate could have been. "I am not asking anything of you tonight. I understand if what I am about to say is unwelcome or ill-timed or simply too much given everything. But I wanted you to know, before anything else happened, that I came here myself because the matter of you is not an administrative one." Gretel looked at him for a long moment. "I gave Lady Elara my notice," she said finally. "I have 2 weeks remaining." "I know," she told me. "I imagine she was not pleased." "She was not." She also told me, and I think she meant it as a warning, that you are stubborn, too educated for your position, and entirely unmanageable. He paused. I found that encouraging. Something that was not quite a smile moved across Gretel's face and then tried to retreat. She looked at her mother. Marta Marin was watching her daughter with the soft, complete attention of someone who has been patient for a very long time. "Go walk with him," Marta said. "Mama, Olivia will read to me. Hazel will help. Go." They walked along the road that ran behind the village cottages toward the eastern pastures, where the light was leaving the sky in long horizontal bands of amber and dark blue. The important man's horse was tethered outside the cottage with the footman and probably being interrogated by Olivia. They walked without speaking for a while, which was comfortable in the way that only a few things are comfortable. Not absence of something, but presence of something that didn't require words to exist. "My sister described you," Adrian said finally, "as worthless. I know. She has told me so directly as well. I want you to know that I disagree. Profoundly, I know that too." She glanced at him. "I have never agreed with her assessment. That is one of the things she found irritating about me." "What are the others?" "She has a list. It is quite long." He made a sound that was unexpectedly a real laugh, brief, genuine, slightly surprised at itself. Gretel found that it was easier to breathe after that. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer honestly, not kindly. Ask, why me? There are other women in this district. Women of education, of family, of appropriate standing. Women who would not come with the complications of my situation. Why a servant girl from a cottage with a broken door?" Adrian was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone genuinely considering, rather than preparing a pleasing answer. "Because," he said at last, "you looked at a shelf of books like a friend you hadn't seen. Because when I asked what you wanted, you told me the true thing without performance. Because you walked out of my sister's room after 2 years of being made small, and you walked like someone who was still entirely intact." He paused. "And because you told me you were afraid of never finding out. That is the fear of someone worth knowing." The last of the light was going from the sky. Gretel stopped walking. She thought about the surveyor's maps and the pre-dawn candle, and the cold mornings and the copper she was always one short of, and the weight of being everything for 3 people who needed her. She thought about 2 years of Lady Elara's careful diminishments, and the word worthless, and the way she had learned to fold herself small to survive. She thought about the library. The 2 hours. His actual questions and his actual silences. I need time, she said. Things do not change overnight for people like me. My family needs, whatever your family needs, it will have. That is not a negotiation, it is an obligation I should have met years ago. That is not why I would say yes, she said, if I say yes. I am telling you that so you understand. I understand, and I will not be managed, she said, or kept small, or spoken for. I would be disappointed if you were. She looked at him in the fading light. He looked back. Thursday, she said, the library. I will have an answer by Thursday. Thursday, he agreed. She turned back toward the cottage. She had gone perhaps 20 steps when she heard him say quietly into the evening air, "There are real maps of the Northern Territories in the library, not just the Harwick survey. Actual expedition records." She did not turn around, but she pressed her lips together, briefly, against a smile that would have been entirely too revealing. She came on Thursday. She sat in the same chair, and he sat across from her, and the maps were already open on the table between them, real expedition records, hand-annotated in faded ink, with marginal notes from 3 different surveyors arguing in the margins of their own document. She spent 20 minutes examining them without speaking. He watched her with no apparent impatience. "This notation here," she said, pointing, "disagrees with Harwick's boundary markers. Harwick places the river fork at 4 degrees north. I know. The expedition found it at 3.5. He leaned forward to see where she was pointing. The margin note in blue ink argues the river shifted in the intervening years, and the black ink disagrees, vehemently. He paused. There is a third surveyor who only wrote in pencil and seems to think both of them are wrong. Gretel laughed, a real one, quick and surprised, and then looked up and found him watching her with an expression so undefended that it made her chest ache. She looked back at the maps. Yes, yes to the maps, yes to Thursday and Friday, and to whatever this is. She smoothed the corner of the map carefully with her thumb. "I am not promising more than that yet. I am not asking for more than that yet," he said. "Thursday and Friday are enough." They were. For a while, they were more than enough. The estate solicitor executed the provisions of the late Countess Isabel's will in full, including arrangements for Martha Maren's medical care, the cottage repairs, and educational provision for Olivia and Hazel. The door was rehung so that it closed on its own. Mira, who had always seen everything and held her tongue with remarkable discipline, was promoted to head of household staff under the new arrangements and managed the transition with the calm competence of someone who had been waiting for things to make sense and was glad they finally had. Lady Elara and her brother reached a peace that was not warm but was honest. She acknowledged what she had done. He did not pretend it had not happened. They agreed on the shape of a relationship that excluded certain behaviors. It took time. It was imperfect. It was what was possible. On the morning of the announcement that Count Adrian Blackmore would be formally presented with his intended countess at the winter gathering, a messenger arrived at the main castle with a letter. It was from Lady Elara. It said, "Is not worthless." I knew that when I said it. I said it anyway. I am sorry for that, if not for other things. She will be a better countess than I anticipated. Tell her I said so. Gretel read it in the East Library, at the table where the maps still lived, early on a Thursday morning, with the winter light coming through the tall windows. She folded it carefully. She put it in her apron pocket. She still wore aprons. She suspected she always would, old habits being what they were. Then she went to find Adrian, because she had 3 annotations disagreeing with the pencil surveyor, and she required a second opinion. He was in the courtyard with the estate steward, going over the winter contracts. He saw her coming and excused himself. "Good morning," he said. "The pencil surveyor is wrong," she said. "I can prove it. Do you have 20 minutes?" He looked at her, his intended countess, with the escaped strand of hair and the ink on her finger and the apron pocket full of a letter from his sister and a knowledge of maps that put most of his advisors to shame. "I have as long as you need," he said. She smiled at him. He smiled back. They went to look at the maps.